I think philosophy really is puzzle solving, but that makes it sound trivial. But in truth, I mean, it's a certain kind of puzzle. It's when our current thinking, everyday thinking, science, put it all in together, involves incoherence, contradiction. One line of argument leads you one place, and a different line of argument, equally plausible and compelling, leads you to the opposite view, and you've got to sort something out.
So welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we're very pleased to welcome Professor David Papineau. He is Professor of Philosophy at King's College London. His primary philosophical interests and research are focused in philosophy of mind, but also in meaning, metaphysics, and a variety of related issues. His books include, but aren't limited to, Reality and Representation, Thinking About Consciousness, Philosophical Devices, and his new book, The Metaphysics of Sensory Experience. He has also a variety of published articles, and feel free to add anything to that. But with that, welcome Professor David Papineau.
That will cover it fine, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here.
Awesome. So I think in the first sort of section of this discussion, I wanted to discuss your new book on sensory experience, and then we can move into more general questions about some of your work in the field. So I really enjoyed your book, especially some of your discussion against alternative theories of perception, like Naïve realism, strong forms of representationalism, certain like sense datum views, and disjunctivism. And but one thing I wanted to ask about that caught my attention was when discussing Naïve realism, it seems to me that different authors have different conceptions of what that exactly entails. And one that I had in mind specifically was John Searle and his book called Seeing Things as They Are, where on his account of quote unquote Naïve realism, he says that it's something like, it's realism in the sense that we perceive the world, and direct or naive in the sense that we perceive the world not by first perceiving something else intermediate, by means of which or by way of which we perceive the world. Whereas, as I take it, you're construing it, Naïve realism, as a thesis that worldly facts are literally a part of visual experiences of which they're about. And these are clearly very different theories. So I guess my first question is, what do you think of how he or others like him construe Naïve realism, and what is the plausibility of that sort of thesis?
So, have I read Searle? I think I got the book once and kind of looked through it, but I'm not a master of what it says. Look, in my thinking, and I think this is pretty general, Naïve realism and direct realism are very different theories. So I take direct realism to be a denial of sense datum theories, being a denial of the idea that in perception, in the first instance, your mind is focused on some intermediary thing, and that's indirect realism. Sense datum theories are the paradigm of indirect realism. First of all, your mind sees a sense datum, and then perhaps you can infer that there's an external world beyond that. So the thing that I'm looking at through my window, I'm seeing my car. Sense datum theorists say, well, what I'm really seeing is a mental object, a sense datum, a kind of grey car-shaped thing. And then if I'm reflective, I can think, well, that's probably being caused by a real physical car out there. And direct realist views are views that deny that. So I'm a direct realist. David Armstrong's a direct realist. I think that I have a certain conscious sensory state, and in virtue of having it, I represent, I'm happy to say, I'm aware of the physical car outside me. It's not that, first of all, my mind is focused on my mental state and then I infer there's a car. I just see the car by being in a certain mental state, but not by, first of all, having my mind focused on the mental state. So direct realism is a very general view. Basically, it's a denial of sense datum views. Naive realism is a much more specific view. It's the view that the conscious state I'm in when I'm seeing my grey car involves the grey car. And I can't be in that conscious state when there's no grey car there. Okay, I'll stop talking now because perhaps I'm giving you more detail than you want. But that's a terminology. I know this because when I first started working on this, and I was no expert on this about 5-10 years ago, I went around calling naive realism direct realism. And the naive realists said, no, we're not direct realists. We're naive realists. They wear the badge naive with pride.
Yeah, perfect. That's really helpful. I think what might have led me astray there is that I think Searle does use those terms interchangeably. I think he uses naive realism just as another term for direct realism, and he uses them both in the way that you describe.
So maybe he's not fully embedded in the literature then. Not to say
that might be so, but so
I was the same. Before I was fully embedded in literature, I used the terms interchangeably, and I was corrected for doing so.
Right. So, in his form of what we would just call direct realism, then you have no issue with. I mean, he may have other details of his theory that you might take issue with, but that general statement of direct realism is certainly your view as well, right?
Right. I mean, and that's quite important for me because in some ways, my positive view, we might get to it, is a bit like sense datum theories. I mean, there's a conscious mental item, and for me, we're consciously in that state, and it has no essential connection with the world outside. It doesn't have any connection to worldly objects or properties built into it. So to that extent, I'm a bit like a sense statement theorist. But I say in the book, I'm not a sense statement theorist because I don't think that when I'm perceiving, I have any mental act focused on that state. Rather, my mind is focused on the physical car outside in virtue of being in that state, but that state is not an object of any mental focus for me. The mental focus is all on the external physical world.
Right, exactly. I think there's a passage where you make just this point, right? You say, I don't think of ordinary experiencing subjects as aware of their own sensory states. They aren't observing, seeing, or censoring anything like that. Their own consciousness, rather they observing or seeing or sensing ordinary objects like yellow balls in virtue of being in conscious sensory states.
Quite, exactly.
That seems to me completely correct, yeah. So I'm going to move on to just more of the discussion that you make, but I want to take a question from Charming Chalmers on the indirect realism issue. If you wanted to unmute, you can get in voice.
So this is Charming.
Hello.
Hi.
It's not, in fact, David Chalmers.
You're not Dave Chalmers, because I know that because I just left 20 minutes ago, 25 minutes ago, a meeting where Dave Chalmers was talking. So
that's funny. Yeah. So my question is, how would your view work with something like the Humean view of the self, where we're just a collection of different kinds of like mental data, like memories, thoughts, I mean, I guess perceptual experiences and things like that?
I have no objection to that view. I think my view of sensory experience is perfectly compatible with that view. I mean, I do, throughout the book, assume that there are people, that there are persisting entities, people, and that conscious states, sensory state, representational states are states of those people, as a matter of those entities instantiating certain properties, conscious properties, representational properties, and so on. So I'm committed to selves, to persons, as philosophers say, but I think that to be compatible with Hume. I mean, you can have a reductionist reading of Hume. Hume shows us that people are nothing more than collections of mental states. I mean, Hume, I can't remember, does he put it eliminatively? I'm not sure. I mean, he's against the idea of some unified, transcendent soul that's extra to all those mental states, but you can read him as saying that, look, people are nothing but collections of mental states, memories, and so on. And that's kind of my view. So does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think they're pretty independent issues. What account you give of what kind of entities people are, and my views about perception. Now, my views about perception presuppose that there are such things as people who persist through time, but I don't give any special account of that.
All right. So what I took to be the sort of the main point or claim that you're trying to make in this book, and I think successfully, is that our sensory experiences aren't intrinsically directed. They're not essentially representational or anything like that. And that rules out certain theories of sensory experience. But it does
kind of rules them all. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, perhaps we can talk about the sociology of this area in a minute. I mean, I'm in this funny position where I think I have the view that's kind of common standard view amongst all intelligent people, but in the philosophy of perception, nobody has it. Funny situation.
Yeah, that does seem right. I mean, we just, like, intuitively, we just think of our qualitative experiences as just that. And then, like, fundamentally, that's anything with that same sort of qualitative character is going to be the same sort of experience. But there might be other features that, given which they gain a certain representational quality. I think that seems to me the more intuitive view than saying they're intrinsically about things. Why do you think that view was and to some extent still is quite popular in the literature?
I'm not sure. I mean, first thing I was about to say, until I corrected myself because it's not as simple as that, was that maybe I'm somewhat non-standard among philosophers in that I have a naturalist reductive account of representation. I mean, that's kind of something I've worked on much of my philosophical career. I mean, what is it for one thing to stand for another? How can I don't know, a sentence or a state of my head represent that Lima is the capital of Peru, and represent a state of affairs on the other side of the earth? That's always been a puzzle, and I'm inclined to give some kind of causal, biological account of what it is for one state to represent another, and in a way what I've been doing the philosophy of perception. I mean, it's a new area for me. I didn't work on it till about 10 years ago, and started thinking about perception in the context of working out various naturalist ideas about perception. And I realized, look, I'm not a representationalist. The things I think are inconsistent with representationalism. So one answer is that many people inside the philosophy of perception aren't committed or aren't interested or have never bought into a naturalist account of representation. So there's what I call the phenomenal intentionality people, who think that representation depends on consciousness, and I don't want to be too rude, but consciousness is kind of magic, and you get representation coming out of the magic of consciousness, and so I'm against all those people, and so that's one reason I'm different from what's going on in the philosophy of perception. But having said that, I mean, apart from the naive realists, who are something else again, there are a bunch of people in the philosophy of perception who do think about representation like me, but then get committed to the idea that sensory consciousness is essentially representational via their desire to explain consciousness in terms of representation. So they're not like the phenomenal intentionality people who think that consciousness is magic and real representation requires the magic of consciousness. These are people who think that representation isn't magic. Representation can be explained like I want to explain it, in terms of causal and biological considerations, and then think that consciousness isn't magic. It can be explained in terms of representation like that. Their view at first pass is that systems are conscious just in case they have minds that allow them to represent. So, yes, so I don't have a simple answer. I mean, I think that's the wrong way to think about consciousness, and I think it leads you into all kinds of tangles. But there's no simple answer to why. The standard view I have, doesn't really have any obvious adherence in the philosophy of perception. I mean, so standard view, I think if you talk to any neuroscientists, people working on the neuroscience of perception, they'd say, right, there's all this stuff going on inside your head, and that's what makes you conscious when you're having sensory experience. And then as it happens, these things going on inside your head are systematically correlated with features of the world, and that's why they represent features of the world. But you could imagine a being who had just the same things going on inside their head, conscious in just the same way, who lived in a different environment, used those states of their brain to represent quite different things. We've all seen The Matrix. There's Neo when he's Envatted. When he's in the pod. He's got a brain just like mine. I assume he's conscious just like me. But he's representing states of the Matrix. He's not representing the real, normal physical world. So that seems to me a completely standard and natural view. And as I said, for rather complicated reasons, it's not at all prominent in the philosophy of perception.
So, on one of the first things you said about philosophers who, take conscious to be some sort of magical thing, somewhat pejoratively, fine. Do you think part of the issue is that they have this somewhat vague or non-committal theory of mind, non-committal in a certain way, that I don't know, they think they can just get these other properties of the mental for free, that they don't have to be restricted by some sort of commitment to naturalism or something like that in how they theorize about them? And that might lead to...
Let's be fair. Okay. So this problem of representation, how is it that one thing can stand for another? How is it that a certain state lays claim to something beyond itself? There's a way in which that problem, as it's a problem for me and many other people, is a kind of modern philosophical problem from the middle of the last century. And it first came out, clearly for me, in the context of the kind of computer model of the brain. How can a state of a computer stand for something else if your brains are just computers? But I guess the issue is more general. If your brains are just physical, how is it that one physical state stands for another? Now, that's a problem which I and many other people had, and we kind of tried various answers to it. But if you look back at the history of philosophy, it's not clear that problem is there in the same way, and I think it's for the reason that you mentioned, that the history of philosophy, by and large, regards consciousness as either independent of the physical, as for Descartes, or as constituting the world we live in, as for the idealists. And so they take consciousness as given as their starting point, and consciousness is taken to have a pile of properties, and maybe, let's add in one more, the property of the conscious mind to stand for something other than itself. So if you're taking consciousness to be basic, then maybe the power of the mind to represent is an easy add-on. Whereas if you're taking the physical world to be basic, and maybe you're reductionist about consciousness, then it looks like representation is something that really needs an explanation. But having said that, I said, let's be fair. The people who now want to explain representation in terms of consciousness, and I, perhaps unfairly caricatured, but I wanted to get the idea across, think it's somehow a magical upshot of the structure of consciousness. They get pressed by their opponents, and mostly they're not idealists. So now you've got a situation where they're thinking of consciousness as something kind of goes on inside the head, and now they're taking it as given that it represents things going on in the world beyond the head, and then there is a puzzle. Either you wave your hand and you say it's magic, or you've got to give some story about how it is that this conscious mind stuff inside the head that feels like something for us, how does it get to stand for things beyond the head? The phenomenal intentionality people certainly do think of the consciousness inside the head, unlike the naive realists, and have a puzzle there. And what you're finding more and more is that they end up saying that, well, what the mind is representing is really that there's something outside that produces a certain mental response. And so they end up being very almost Kantian, that the world out there is something beyond our ken, beyond our power even to represent. All we can represent is that it has certain dispositions to produce results in us. So they become in a kind of way almost all the familiar properties, not just the secondary qualities, but the shapes and the textures and so on, all become response-dependent properties. So, okay, yeah, you're right. The idea starts off, let's just give consciousness another bit of extra power to represent, but the serious people working in that tradition now come under pressure to explain how consciousness, which is something internal inside the head, how does it have a relation to things outside the head? And they end up with some rather surprising kind of neo-Kantian stories about how that works.
Yeah, you discussed that in the book a bit. It's implausible at best that those that response works across the board. Even if it does work regarding certain quote unquote secondary qualities, color, sound, taste, and so on. It's not obvious and implausible that it will work for all others.
Well, so I say in the book, but since writing that, things are starting to move on, and I'm noticing more and more people in the tradition I'm criticizing there actually take up that possibility and run with it. So, as in a talk earlier this afternoon, before David Chalmers, Michelle Montague, who's a prominent phenomenal intentionalist, and she says, well, if you push me, I think that all the things we can think about are just we're thinking about them as things that produce certain conscious responses in us. And she said it's a kind of neo-Kantian view. And Uriah Kriegel, when you look in the details of what he thinks the conscious mind can represent, it comes to the same thing. So maybe that line of thought deserves rather more consideration and analysis than I give it in the book. I mean, having said, look, this is what these people are going to be pushed to, I say, but that's absurd. Let's leave it there. But I think many of them are, as I said, happy to pick that up and run with it.
So wait, so if that did, if it did turn out to be not so absurd, then that view that entails that might otherwise be plausible, in your view?
No,
this was the phenomenal intentionalist.
No. So the question is right now, suppose I say, look, your view implies this. We don't think about any properties other than the power of the world to produce certain responses in us. And I say your view implies that. And in the book, I say, well, that's pretty hopeless, isn't it? And stop there. And now there are people who say, well, my view does imply that, and I don't think it's so hopeless. So all that's needed now, I mean, I have an obligation to say why I think it's hopeless. In the book, I didn't say why I thought it was hopeless. I just said, isn't it obviously hopeless? Why do I think it's hopeless? Well, you can do it two ways. You can say, like Kant, that the noumena, the things in themselves, we have no contact with, that we don't even have the ability to think coherently about them and so on. That's very close to idealism, and I think, well, let's assume that idealism is not somewhere we want to go. The other alternative is to say, well, we're limiting the power of the conscious mind to represent purely qua conscious mind to these response-dependent properties, and then we think that behind them are all the properties described by science, the scientific image in Seller's terminology. And now it turns out that the story that these people have is just about the ability to represent, as it were, the manifest features of the world, and not an account of how we represent the real mind-independent features of the world. And at that point, I want to say, but don't we want an account of how we represent the real mind-independent features of the world? Don't we want to think that perception and other modes of thought guide us with respect to the mind-independent features of the world? And a view that doesn't give an account of that seems to be deficient in that respect.
Yeah, fair enough. I do wonder if people will push back and say that this approach could offer something in that respect, and exactly how that will be spelled out, I'm not sure. But
yeah, okay. Look, as I said, I mean, there seems to me, given the way the literature and this contemporary tradition is moving, there's further debate needed than I give in the book. Yeah.
All right. So, yeah. So, your account of how our sensory experiences, which are not intrinsically representational, gain their representational qualities, is by being generally correlated with certain features of the environment.
Sure. I mean,
so,
I have a more fancy view. It's to do with their being designed to be correlated with certain features of the environment,
right.
or part of that is they guide our actions in a way appropriate to certain features of the environment, which is not the same as they're being correlated with those features, because sometimes they guide our actions in that way when they aren't correlated with those features, as when we act on false thoughts. But I think for the big picture, the idea that there's things inside our head and they're correlated with things outside our head, that's all we need for now.
Right. And what you mentioned there is related to some of your work on like teleosemantics. That's a similar sort of theory going on there. Yeah. So someone could agree with almost everything you have to say about the sensory experiences, them not being intrinsically directed in that way, but disagree with what makes them, or what gives them contingently, their representational qualities. And one view that you discuss, I think briefly, I worried not enough though, was the sort of role-based theories, or semantic role-based theories. And the issue you have with those, or what I recall you saying was something like, they're not those sort of conceptual or inferential relations, or the sort of roles they play, aren't enough to suffice for genuine representation. That they need to.
Good, yeah.
They don't give us the kind of connection between those states and the substance in the world that we expect for states that are actually representational. I guess someone could just accept that they aren't connected with stuff in that way, but that they don't need those sorts of connections or correlations to count as representational. In general, they are connected in that way. And then we can say that there is an object correctly represented. Represented there is, I guess, a sort of success term. But that for them to be representational in the first place doesn't require that there is an object, in fact, correctly represented, or even that those sorts of states are generally correlated with the objects so represented.
Okay. We don't want to degenerate into just a terminological issue. So your thought is, quite early in the book, I say that I'm taking representation to be a matter of having a truth condition. Right, so the states of representation, if it lays claim, right? So I've got a state of my visual system now, and I take it lays claim to there being a car-shaped grey thing outside the window I'm looking through, and it's going to be true veridical if that's the case, and false if I'm suffering an illusion. So that's the basic thing. I mean, a state's representational only if it has an accuracy condition, truth condition. Okay. Now I can imagine somebody saying, no, that's too much. I mean, isn't it enough for a state to be representational that it's connected with a lot of other states via kind of inferential causal patterns in a kind of systematic way? So you might imagine the states of a computer that involve a whole lot of registers and coding and programming, and so you must say, look, that's already representational. And I don't have a fight there. I mean, I don't have a fight, but I want to say, look, what you've described isn't enough yet to give us a truth condition. Take that computer so set up. It might be representing, for all you said, the payroll of King College London or the traffic flow. Where are you, Troy? Where are you in the world at the moment?
I'm in Canada.
Canada. Which city?
Ottawa.
Ottawa. Right. So it might be representing the traffic flow in Ottawa, or it might be representing a whole lot of other things. And so if you want to call what's going on inside a computer representation, that's fine by me, but it's not representation in my sense, because it doesn't determine a truth condition. And if you want to say that what constitutes my conscious sensory state I'm having at the moment is that kind of internal causal role representation, I'm using my fingers to put square quotes there, I won't argue with that either. So that's just terminology. I want to say that having a certain truth condition can't be what constitutes your conscious state as the state it is. So do you want to defend conceptual role, inferential role, causal role semantics a bit more?
Yeah. So I guess I'm not very much decided on this issue, but I guess the way to push back would be to try to argue that we can get truth conditions out of the sort of conceptual world based semantics. How exactly, I'm not sure, but do you think there's some way that's sort of ruled out at the outset? That's not something that could be done?
Yeah, maybe I should have said more in the book, but here's how the argument goes at this point. Two options. One is you extend a causal role outside the head, sometimes called long-arm functional role. So now it's part of the functional role of the internal state I have that is caused by grey things out there, or car-shaped things, and so on. That's fine. I don't really think of that as conceptual role semantics anymore. It's more the kind of correlational story about correlations between internal things and external things. And what's more, that kind of long arm inferential causal role doesn't look like the right thing to fix consciousness anymore, which is my main opponent. So people think that consciousness and representation are essentially tied together. So that's one way to go, and that brings you basically closer to my own view. The other way is to say that these internal causal structures represent anything that's isomorphic to them. So this is Robert Cummins' view, and he says that computer, it represents the traffic flow in Ottawa, and it represents the payroll in King's College London, and it represents the movements of the water molecules in that bucket over there, and it represents everything that's isomorphic to it. And then there's a further question about what do we actually use the computer to help us deal with. But for Cummins, it promiscuously represents everything that's isomorphic to it. Okay. At that point, I'll say representation in that sense, that's perfectly good thing to constitute conscious sensory states. But isn't that a hopeless theory of representation? That what's going on inside my head represents all the different structures in the universe that are isomorphic to it? Okay, so I just argue against that as a theory of representation. And I don't think there's another way to do it. Either you have very promiscuous representation, which is unsatisfactory in itself, or you go long arm and then you basically become correlational.
Yeah, if it turns out that those are the only avenues, I think that's right. Then that those don't. No, that neither of those seem plausible. I guess I'm not really convinced that those are the only ways to do it, but I'm not. I guess
okay, well, I'd be curious to see. I mean, I'm just thinking of the literature, and people sometimes talk about two factors. They say that there's this internal factor, the internal structure, and admit that that by itself doesn't determine truth conditions. And then there's the external factor, which is the correlation with features of the environment. And they say, look, representation has two parts. If you want to talk, and I'm not too fussed, and I'd be perfectly happy to say, look, the sensory consciousness goes with the first factor, the internal causal role. In the book, I say I'm perfectly open to that. I'm quite happy with that idea.
And that comes up in when you talk about sort of broad versus narrow contents. Is that correct?
Yes. So I do say that a lot of the literature about broad and narrow contents seems to me to distract attention from the more fundamental issues. The kind of things we've been talking about so far are the more fundamental issues. Then there's the feature that if you're a representationalist in the philosophy of perception, you are going to rule out broad contents, and people think, yeah, okay, well, perhaps we can do that by showing that the sensory experiences don't, in fact, have broad contents. And it starts to look like a technical issue, but the real issue, the more fundamental issue, is look, it's consciousness goes with what's going on inside the head, and representation goes with correlations between what's inside the head and what's outside the head. And to equate representational features of experience with the conscious nature of experience is just trying to mix two kind of incommensurable kinds of properties.
Right, you either have to rule out those external relations or allow for sort of external consciousness, broad consciousness in a way. And both those seem unattractive. Right? Yeah. All right. So I wanted to bring up a couple of, I'm not sure if they're intuitions or maybe problem cases that come to mind when I think about this notion of representation. So you give your requirement that there only be some correlation allows for cases of misrepresentation and misperception. But what about the case where we're sort of like almost systematically misrepresenting things, or like usually the usual case we misrepresent it? Does that become impossible because there's no general correlation there between the sensory experience and the thing in the world, or how do we make sense of that?
That's the reason that I and many other people moved away from a simple correlational account of representation to something that involves biological design or considerations of the kind of behavior that the representational states give rise to. Because the problem, if you talk about correlations, look, my certain sensory state is correlated with snakes, say, so it represents snakes, but it's also correlated with wiggly shadows or convincing rubber snakes and so on. And so if we just take as the truth condition of the state the whole category of external circumstances which will trigger it and which it's correlated with in that sense, then we don't seem to have any room to explain that you're judging falsely. You're misperceiving when you see the wiggly shadow as a snake. So that's the point at which people in teleosemantics say, look, it's not a matter of what actually caused it, it's more a matter of what it's supposed to be caused by, in the sense that it's designed to come on when there's a real snake there and not when there's a wiggly shadow. And in fact, you're malfunctioning when you get the state coming on when there's a wiggly shadow. And that idea goes with an idea that you can invoke without really bringing in biology too much if you want to, which is what gives the state its content is not what causes it, but more what behavior it gives rise to. That state will cause you to behave in a snake-appropriate way. And you jump up, you run away, and so on. And that behavior is appropriate to the presence of real snakes. If you behave in that way when there's just a wiggly shadow there, you're wasting your time and energy. So those are two ways in which to do better than a crude correlational account, and in fact they're not that strongly distinguished. There's the idea of when the state's biologically designed to be present, and that's tied up with when the behavior it gives rise to is appropriate to the circumstances.
Right, I see. So it's not, right. You do mention this briefly in the book. So in the case where the skeptical scenario or whatever, the subject is envatted, want to, what is it that they represent certain things about their skeptical situation, or they're not really representing anything at all, or what goes on there?
There's going to be cases and cases. If you kind of took me and stuck me in a virtual machine that made it seem to me like I'm not in a virtual machine, I'd say I'm misrepresenting. I mean, I'm designed to get into this state when there's a real car there, not when I'm being fed electronic impulses from the matrix. A being who's always lived in a pod, like all the poor souls, Neo's colleagues, then you might feel that, or they've been there for a long time. Maybe if I've been in the computer for a long time, my states will switch from representing real cars to representing cars in the computer. So yeah, I mean, I guess you want to feel that the person who is a brain in the vat is deceived. If it's me and you take me and put me in a vat, then I'll be deceived, all right, because I'm designed to deal with the real world. It's not so obvious. Beings that have, the machines have taken over and they've been evolving humans for thousands of years to exist within the matrix. Are they being deceived? I mean, it's a tricky issue that comes up in discussions of skepticism. I mean, some people argue against skepticism on the grounds that beings who've been in the matrix for a long time, they're not deceived at all. I mean, all they're thinking about is matrix cars and matrix trees, and they're perfectly right about them. But yeah, you might feel that there's something a bit unsatisfactory about that. Surely a being who's in a matrix is deceived at some level.
Yeah, I mean,
the views I have about representation leave you lots of wiggle room in respect of those scenarios to go different ways.
Right. Yeah, it just seems really like a strong intuition to me that like I could be in principle, even though I think I'm not, in a sort of skeptical scenario like this, right? I can't rule it out based on the experiences that I have. But if I am, is it that all the sort of representations that I have, or at least think I have, are about matrix things and as opposed to real concrete physical objects? That just seems wrong. And it almost feels like what my thoughts or representations are about is neutral between whether I'm in those sorts of skeptical scenarios or not. But sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, this is your problem, not mine.
No, yeah, that's fair.
So if you have a strong intuition that suppose all of us, suppose for the sake of argument, all of us, we're just like Neo in the Matrix, right? And you have a strong intuition that if that were the case, we'd be deceived. We'd be wrong. I don't know how much you want us to be wrong about, but we'd be wrong somewhere. Well, then it's a challenge for you to come up with a theory of representation that's so powerful, as it were, as to give me truth conditions that are violated under that supposition. But it's kind of not my problem. It's not obvious to me that I'm deceived about all the obvious things in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean that's fair, I guess. I'd have to first maybe pump that intuition, and second provide an adequate account that can make sense of truth conditions and representations that are consistent with that. And obviously there would be work to be done there. I guess I would just wanted to state that intuition. I don't know. I feel like a lot of people have that, but
my theory of representation is quite chunky and powerful. So as I said, it's all to do with biological design. So if I haven't been biologically designed to be a brain in a vat, then I've already got the toehold to give my states of semantics that will make them false if I'm a brain in a vat. The hard case for me is beings who've kind of evolved in the matrix. They've always lived in the matrix. And when I say that's a hard case, I now second thought is it's not so obvious to me that beings who'd always lived in the matrix, there was no sense in they were designed for something better, would be deceived. Anyway, there's a lot of rather tricky literature on these issues, and I tend to admire it from afar myself.
Awesome, fair enough. Yeah, a lot of rabbit holes to follow there as well. That can get quite complicated. But yeah, we could move on to something
sure,
related to some of the other work, if that's all right.
Yeah, I'd be happy.
So I had you're of course very well known for some of your work in philosophy of mind and developing a phenomenal concept strategy. And I think you have sort of remarked in the past that maybe, I think you've mentioned Ruth Millikan's book on concepts, and maybe that we could dispense with them. And I was wondering if we really should dispense with the notion of concepts. which may not be a very well formed idea, maybe something that we could dispense with. Can we still make sense of the quote unquote phenomenal concept strategy without that, or what would be the approach there?
Yes. So the basic idea that Millikan has been pushing increasingly, especially in beyond concepts, but you can go back to White Queen psychology. We could talk about that in the title maybe a bit later, is that we don't need to cut concepts any finer than reference. So there's in analytic philosophy, we learn very early on, Frege, sense and reference. So any concept, first of all, it's got a sense, something that kind of points you at the external world, and then the arrow will kind of hit onto some feature of the external world, and then it gets a reference. But you can't have a reference without a sense. And under Millikan's influence, I've been more and more persuaded that this leads to all kinds of terrible mistakes in philosophy. And it's much simpler just to say that there's vehicles of thought in the head, and they refer to things in the external world. They kind of get causally linked up with things in the external world, and they get correlated with things in the external world, and we don't need any extra things. We just got the words, and we've got their reference. Okay, what about Frege cases? What about when somebody has a word, Hesperus, word phosphorus, and they refer to the same thing? Does that mean they've just got one concept? So no. So you have to add to the basic picture that people have the same concept if they both have words that refer to the same thing. That sometimes people can have two words that refer to the same thing and not realize that they so refer. But we don't have to suppose that somehow they've got different senses. We can just say they got two words and they don't realize that they co-refer. So somebody who dispenses with senses and just kind of types concept by reference does have to add in immediately, I mean, as an obvious observation, that sometimes, as you might put it, people are unaware that two words in their language of thought have the same reference and have the same concept in that sense. And that seems to me to give room for phenomenal concepts. Most people aren't physicalists. They have a way of thinking about a word for, I don't know, the experience of pain, and another word for C fibers firing, and they don't realize that these are two words for the same thing. So you can, as it were, reconfigure the phenomenal concept strategy without, basically think of phenomenal words in the language of thought being distinct from the words for the brain states that constitute phenomenal state, the reference of the phenomenal concepts. But perhaps, does everybody who's going to be listening know about phenomenal concepts, do you think? I mean, I jump straight in.
Probably not. I think if you want to give like a brief description, that might be helpful, actually. I mean, I'm familiar with it, but there's some people that aren't. Okay,
it's all to do with I guess most people will be familiar with Frank Jackson's Mary argument. So Mary expert brain scientist, knows all about everything about vision science. She knows about the experience of red is certain oscillation in V4, and then but she's never had any red experiences herself, and she's never had any color experiences. And then one day she has color experiences, and Jackson says, well, she learned something that she didn't know before. She learns that that ripe tomatoes cause this feeling because she's had the feeling of seeing something red. And Jackson said, but look, she knew about all the physical facts. She knew that ripe tomatoes caused oscillations in V4. So if physicalism is true, how can she possibly learn anything new on having a red experience for the first time? And the a posteriori physicalists say, look, it's just like any scientific case. You have two names for the same thing. We have water and we have H2O. We have certain oscillation in V4 and this feeling. And what Mary didn't know before she came out was that as we put it, ripe tomatoes cause this feeling. But that's just because she's now acquired a new word for something she knew about before, just as you might acquire a new word for some chemical substance you only knew in terms of chemistry. I mean, imagine somebody who'd never come across water. Now they can recognize water. So now they know that that stuff flows in rivers. Well, all they used to know is that H2O flowed in rivers. But all you've got here is two terms for the same thing. So Jackson's argument doesn't show that feeling, the feeling of seeing something red, is anything different from a certain oscillation in V4. It just shows somebody could have a word for it as an oscillation in V4 without having the word for it as feeling. So the a posteriori physicalists say that Mary's acquired a new phenomenal concept for the experience of seeing something red, whereas before she could only name it as an oscillation in V4 using her scientific concepts. Now she has a new word for it, this feeling. And that's the phenomenal concept. Though now under your pressure, being beyond concepts, perhaps I'll say she has a new phenomenal word in the language of thought, not a new phenomenal concept, but it seems to me the same idea.
Absolutely. Yeah, that seems fair enough. I was wondering on just in more general on reference and such. Do you accept sort of direct reference or sort of like the causal theory of reference or anything like that, or are you more just open to those ideas, or what's your view on that?
Yes, I'm inclined to be very open to the idea of direct reference, and it's important in the context of that phenomenal concept story that phenomenal concepts refer directly and not via some kind of description. If you have phenomenal concepts referring by description, then the physical story all goes wrong. And there's a standard argument against physicalism about conscious experiences, against a posteriori physicalism, which is in effect that because phenomenal concepts refer directly, it ought to be a priori that the feeling of seeing something red is oscillations in V4.
This Kripke's argument, basically.
It's yeah, well, let's not call it Kripke's argument, because I have another little side hobby of mine. I think that this reading of Kripke is a misreading of Kripke, but it's Chalmers's argument. It's Jackson's result. It's a two-dimensional argument against a posteriori physicalism, and the thought is that we only find a difference between necessary truths and a posteriori truths when we have indirect reference. And the thought is that if you're thinking about something directly, then all its necessary properties will be revealed to you. All its essential properties will be revealed to you. So I think that seeing something red is oscillation fine V4 is necessary truth, and it's denial that seeing red is not equal to V4 is an impossibility. And people like Chalmers say, no, but if it was an impossibility, it wouldn't be conceivable. I mean, you're thinking about the red experience directly when you're thinking about it phenomenally, and you ought to be able to see what its nature is if you're thinking about it in that way. You can't think brutally impossible things. I mean, people can think perfectly coherently. I mean, many people believe that that the feeling of something red is not oscillations in V4. But if that's an impossibility, and they're thinking in terms of directly referring terms, they wouldn't be able to think that. You can't think brute impossibilities. But people like me think, sure, you can think brute impossibilities. Phenomenal concepts refer directly. Thoughts about oscillations in V4 refer directly. They're the same thing. It's impossible they should be different. But I can easily believe, as many people do, that they are different. So, right, I'm telling this story because it's coming round to something I mentioned before. Ruth Millikan's earlier book, before Beyond Concepts, was White Queen Psychology. And the reason she called it White Queen Psychology is because there's a passage in Alice Through the Looking Glass where the White Queen asks Alice to believe. So I can't remember what she asked Alice to believe. Maybe something to do with backwards causation. Alice says, I can't believe impossible things. And the White Queen says, I dare say you haven't had much practice. I often believe 6 impossible things before breakfast.
Right.
So the book is a reference to the fact that you can believe impossible things, that there is direct reference, but it doesn't mean that everything you're thinking about is going to be automatically revealed to you. You can mistakenly believe things that are brutally impossible.
So, some views about how we develop our quote unquote phenomenal concepts or phenomenal terms, let's say, hold that they are constructed in a sort of demonstrative way, or is it this a sort of recognitional concept? Like another one of those when we kind of introspect on our experiences. Do you think that's a view like that, or one of those views is at all plausible? And would that count as a sort of direct reference, or is it by thinking in terms of a demonstrative, is that a sort of indirect reference?
So, I wrote a paper about, I don't know, 15 years ago called Perceptual and Phenomenal Concepts. And I modeled phenomenal concepts on perceptual concepts. I had them both referring pretty directly. I appealed to Millikan's idea of concepts that refer to substances. It's something I got very interested in. I mean, she has this general notion of substances as features of the world that richly informative, that cluster properties together. I mean, this includes natural kinds, biological species, chemical substances, all kinds of types of stuff, mud. She thinks individual persisting objects are also substances in this sense. And she thinks they're kind of very chunky features of reality, and they kind of attract reference. They're reference attractors. It doesn't take much to refer to them. So I had this picture, you know, child sees a new animal, they just take animal concept off the animal concept shelf. I mean, maybe I should be saying animal word off the animal word shelf, and it just locks onto that kind of animal. So now they've got a word for elephant, and they start accumulating information about elephant, and nothing much more is needed. And in that paper, I modeled phenomenal concepts on that, but now they're referring to types of experiences rather than to types of observable things or animals. But in the book, if you've read right through to the end, in the new book, I develop a rather different account of phenomenal concepts, which makes them rather less direct. I mean, your question has slightly thrown me. They're going to be direct in the way that matters for the arguments for physicalism. But in the book, I have them piggybacking on perceptual concepts for external things like grayness or car-shapedness, in a way I didn't have them so piggybacking earlier. But
right,
yeah, I mean, I now think of them as, instead of thinking of a kind of primitive, unstructured concept for red experience, this feeling, as I put it, I'm now thinking of them as, we refer to that experience in a somewhat descriptive way as experience caused by red things. So it piggybacks directly on the perceptual concept of red things. And that makes them rather more complicated. But as I argue in the book, the arguments for physicalism against Jackson still go through the same way.
Yeah, this brings, part of what you said there brings to mind criticism that's been made by Chalmers and others that phenomenal concepts, as often described, are a bit empty. They don't give us enough information about the things that's supposed to be concepts of, and so can't play that sort of role that we expect them to play. Do you think having them piggyback on sort of the things they're visual experiences of or perceptual experiences of in this way can help overcome that? Or I guess more generally, what do you think about that worry that the phenomenal concepts?
I'm not really tuned into that worry. I don't think of Dave Chalmers as somebody who is against phenomenal concepts, just the opposite. I mean, he distinguishes various kinds of phenomenal concepts, but he's very much with the physicalists who respond to Jackson's argument by saying at first pass what Jackson's argument shows is that we have ways of thinking about conscious states that typically derive from having those conscious states, and perhaps get their referential power from their association with those conscious states. I mean, he's with the physicalists thus far. Where he differs is in the argument we're talking about, where he says, look, phenomenal concepts, because they're semantically direct, must be epistemologic direct as well. So they must reveal all the essential features of their reference. And that's the point where the physicalists and Chalmers disagree. So, I mean, he thinks phenomenal concepts are kind of special in a way that precludes your being ignorant about their reference. But as far as the existence of phenomenal concepts goes, I take him to be at one with the a posteriori physicalist. So I'm not quite sure what criticism you have in mind. I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I'm trying to think of which papers I have in mind, because there's I remember reading a response from Robert Schroer discussing this issue in his paper called "Where's the Beef? Phenomenal Concepts of both demonstrative and substantial." But and there's a few papers that he was responding to, and there's a couple other papers like this.
But
who claim that they're not substantive enough.
I can see that, if phenomenal concepts are demonstrative, I mean, a view that I once had but I gave up, then they're really very thin. You have a sensory experience, right. You refer to it as this experience. Really, it's doesn't carry any information, that's for sure. And what's more, it's a way of referring you can only use when you're having the experience. And so they're going to be concepts that aren't much use in a lot of ways. But still, I mean, the physicalist who appeals to them doesn't especially need them to be much use beyond being the kind of concept that Mary wouldn't have had until she came out her black and white room. That's all the a posteriori physicalist needs them for. So it's not clear to me why they need them to be specially substantial. Anyway, this is all in this issue. It's there's lots of moving parts here. And as I said, I mean, having changed from the demonstrative view to a more direct reference view, I now have a yet third view on how phenomenal concepts work. So I don't think we can go through all that now.
Yeah, fair enough. So I wanted to ask about a sort of argument that you've used or that you find compelling in favor of physicalism. We'll talk about as a causal closure argument, or the relevance of the mental and the physical world. I guess first, some people have worries about how to spell out causation, and maybe some people doubt that there are genuine causal relations in the world in the first place. Do you think this sort of argument can be made without having to rely on this an account of causation that may be unclear or controversial?
Yes, good question. So the bit of the causal closure argument that's, well, it's causal argument for physicalism that's doing the real work is the closure premise. So premise 1, mental events have physical effects. Premise 2, all physical effects have sufficient physical causes insofar as they have sufficient causes at all. Premise 3, the physical effects of mental causes aren't overdetermined. I mean, it's a funny kind of argument. It's useful because it kind of systematizes the options, but the first premise is just an expression of one's disinclination to be an epiphenomenalist. It's not an argument against epiphenomenalism. It's just saying let's put epiphenomenalism to one side. Mental states have physical effects, and the third premise, similarly, I mean, there's some people in this area who are over-determinationists. They think my behavior has both a physical cause and a mental cause. They're over-determined. So the third premise just puts that to one side. The second premise is the interesting one because it rules out interactive dualism. It says that there aren't any things going on in the brain, the pineal gland, that are due to Cartesian interactive mental causes and not physical causes. So it's normally put, that crucial premise, in terms of causation. But I myself have become unhappy about putting it in terms of causation for the kind of reasons that you were gesturing at. It's a rather difficult, non-fundamental notion, causation. I mean, you were suggesting almost eliminativism. I wouldn't want to go that far, but I certainly think it's not fundamental. After all, fundamental physics is temporally symmetric, and causation certainly isn't. It looks like it's something that arises at a certain higher level. And because of that kind of thinking, I've now come to the view that it's not obvious that causal closure is even true, that every physical effect has a physical cause. Maybe some physical effects have high-level causes that it would beg the question to call physical. So I'm now inclined to put the argument not in terms of causal closure, but in terms of determinational closure. That all physical occurrences are determined insofar as they're determined at all, or they have their chances determined if they aren't fully determined by prior physical events according to physical laws. And that premise that's not put in terms of causation at all seems to me sufficient to rule out dualism and establish physicalism. And again, the eliminativist, the epiphenomenalist and the overdeterminationist positions just get put to one side as overly metaphysically complicated, given the other options on the table, and interactive dualism is ruled out on the grounds that the determinational closure of the physical leaves no room for independent mental events to make a difference to what happens. So I'm quite persuaded by Yablow's idea of proportional causation, that causes need to be sufficient for their effects, but no more specific than is needed for them to be sufficient. So when the pigeon pecks the disc because it's red, it's going to peck at all and only red discs. The disc, as it happens, is also scarlet. It's not true that the pigeon pecked because it was scarlet. And by the same lights, I don't think my behavior is due to the very specific neuronal arrangements I have that precede my behavior. It's due to much more generic property that goes with my wanting to hail a cab, say. So I think it would beg the question to suppose that all physical effects have physical causes, but I still think the same scientific evidence establishes that all physical effects are determined by prior physical states. So that's where I'd go on that issue now.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That taxi cab, hailing a taxi example, I think you mentioned in that paper, that same paper where you discuss like reductive accounts of causation and the tree of the physical. I've heard people in response to that say, well, maybe fundamental physics isn't really symmetric. We see things. Apparently, there's quote unquote like the CP violations that things evolve slightly differently one way rather than the other, or maybe there's maybe in quantum mechanics there's something that's different about the way it evolves to the future than the past. How much do you think that sort of argument for causation not being fundamental rests on the truth of that claim that fundamental physics really is symmetric?
Interesting. So your question is,
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking through. I don't think CP violation itself. Okay, the question is, can we get the asymmetry of causation down into fundamental physics? That's your thought. Why suppose it's a high level phenomenon? Why isn't it there at the bottom? I think that violation of parity isn't the kind of thing that looks like it's going to ground causation. So put that to one side. Then there's the, how shall I put it, apparent asymmetry of quantum mechanics. So we have at least apparent wave function collapses, and they are certainly temporally asymmetric. So, and in fact, I've been working, I've got a new project, which is an approach to causation in terms of where does the asymmetry come from, what's the nature of causation, and okay, I'll advertise it now. There's a paper on my website. It's going to be a bigger paper, it's going to be a book, and I think that the direction of causation is grounded in apparent wave function collapses in quantum mechanics, and the fact that they tend to happen probabilistically independently of each other. So I think that the structure of causation, the structure of quantum mechanic wave function collapses are very much the same kind of thing. But whether quantum mechanical wave function collapses are part of fundamental physics, that's another whole issue. And I guess orthodox, kind of pre-modern, 60 years ago, Copenhagen interpretations of quantum mechanics took that to be real. There really was a real basic dynamic process that You had the Schrödinger illusion, and then in addition, you had wave function collapses. But it's not that popular a view anymore among philosophers of physics. I mean, that's a GOW option, is there really are real wave function collapses at the fundamental level. But I think, along with other people who endorse no collapse theories, I mean, either Everettianism, which I favor, or Bohmianism, think that the apparent wave function collapses are themselves macroscopic phenomena, they're akin to the asymmetry of thermodynamics. In fact, David Wallace, the leading Everettian, thinks of them as pretty much the same thing. So that's why I think that there still isn't any causal asymmetry at the fundamental level. Causal asymmetry is tied up with quantum asymmetry, but quantum asymmetry isn't fundamental either.
Interesting. So it's not that it's because I got the sense that, correct me if I'm wrong, that you were at the very least sympathetic to the view that causal asymmetry is tied up with like thermodynamic or statistical asymmetry of that sort, but it may not be that, or maybe not be that.
So the question. So I think that the causal asymmetry, thermodynamic asymmetry are very much of a piece. They're both macroscopic phenomena that somehow, slightly puzzlingly, emerged from time-symmetric basic physics. So that's given. But you said, is it so obvious that basic physics is time-symmetric? And apart from violations of CPT symmetry, put that to one side, you said, what about quantum mechanics? Isn't quantum mechanics asymmetric? And I guess your thought was, and isn't it part of basic physics?
Yeah.
And my response is, yeah, quantum mechanics is asymmetrical, right? But it's not, that asymmetry is not part of basic physics. That asymmetry is just another variant of the causal stroke thermodynamic asymmetry. It's another asymmetry of very much the same kind.
It's another higher level asymmetry than is what you're saying.
So I mean, this is the view that the wave function collapses are due to decoherence, due to the way that quantum states will interact with macroscopic objects, and then the macroscopic objects are thrown into a superposition, but because they're macroscopic, they tend to, the elements of superposition evolve independently. We conscious beings end up on one or the other, not one or the other. We end up, if we're observing this measurement process, in both branches of the superposition, and it always happens forwards in time. Quantum states interact with macroscopic objects, and then you get the macroscopic branches going off and doing their own thing into the future. Why does it always happen forwards in time? I'm not sure I can spell it out, but the standard view is the answer is going to be rather similar to the answer of why does entropy always increase forwards in time? It's a high-level macroscopic phenomenon. There's nothing inconsistent with the basic laws of physics, which would have the same thing happening in reverse. And I'm not quite sure I can visualize or describe it off the top of my head right now.
No, that's perfectly fine. So I was also wondering, I mean, you've talked about stuff being physical, and then what maybe some higher level things not being physical potentially. Do you have a general notion of what the physical is? How are we understanding that?
good. What we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes in terms of causal closure and thermodynamics and so on, I think all that discussion may as well be under the supposition that contemporary physics is more or less correct, and then you read off from physical theories what's physical. But as you know, many people discussing the mind-brain issue would like a notion of physical which isn't so hostage to the precise correctness of contemporary physical theories. And I think that's the right way to go in that context. I don't think one should look to current physics to tell us what physical means, because then you have the standard Hempel dilemma. Current physics is no doubt going to turn out false, and we don't know what the future physics is going to be. So in that context, I think it works well enough to define physical negatively via via negativa, as it's said. And I mean, in the context of the mind-brain problem, you may as well define physical as not fundamentally mental. So just take physical to be all the things that you don't take to be intrinsically and fundamentally sentient or conscious. So physical just means made of the kind of stuff that you get outside conscious sentient beings. And that's a very open-ended notion of what's physical. I mean, it might be that all kinds of things that current physics doesn't know about might turn out to be part of the fundamental furniture of the world. But as long as those things don't involve any fundamental mentality, it won't make any difference to the mind-body debate. I mean, the kind of arguments we were talking about earlier, the causal closure arguments, they tell us that the conscious mind is one and the same as something else, something that's not mental. And that's the interesting upshot of the argument, that the conscious mind is going to reduce to something that's not fundamentally conscious. And that conclusion remains highly interesting, even if your notion of the physical, i.e. not fundamentally conscious, is very open-ended indeed.
Yeah, I've seen some philosophers sort of construe physicalism or naturalism as a thesis in that negative sort of way, that look, whatever is fundamental is not the sort of stuff that's going to show up in our the special sciences or the psychological sciences.
So the line I just gave you, not fundamentally conscious, left it open that there might be things that are fundamentally alive, though not conscious. But of course, one could now have a rather more restrictive notion of a physical, which is not fundamentally conscious or fundamentally alive. And the interesting thing is that you will get an argument of a general materialist bent, whichever notion of physical or material you're working with, provided you have a closure premise. I mean, define it how you like, right? So we have the target things, the puzzling things, maybe mental and biological. Define the other category, stuff that's not fundamentally mental or not fundamentally mental or biological, or not fundamentally mental or biological or social. And then if you have evidence for a closure thesis that let's take not fundamentally mental or vital, let's call it inanimate. If you have evidence for a closure thesis that all inanimate effects have inanimate causes or are determined by prior inanimate states, well, then that's enough to give you an argument that the animate, conscious or live things must be constituted by things that aren't fundamentally conscious or alive. And so the crucial question is whether your non-target stuff, the fundamental, I mean the basic stuff, satisfies a closure premise. And if it does, then you've got an argument for a general materialist conclusion. So it doesn't matter how you define physical. You can define it in any number of ways, but provided after you defined it, you have evidence for a closure, the causal closure of the physical, then you have an interesting argument.
Yeah, fair enough. I was wondering something about when we talk about fundamentality. How exactly are we construing that? Is it mereological? I mean, we had a guest on a couple of weeks ago, John Heil, and he's talked about how he's sort of critical of these ideas of sort of levels of reality and so forth. So I'm just wondering how what you have in mind when we're talking about something being more fundamental or less fundamental.
That's a good question. So this via negativa is a bit tricky. So you want to define the physical. You want to cash out what you mean by physical in the context of everything is physical. The mind is physical. And so you say, right, not mental. But you can't just say not mental, because what's going on inside my head is mental, but it's also physical. So you don't want to have that being not mental. So that's why you start saying not fundamentally mental. But I sympathize with you and John Heil that it's not quite clear how it works out, that putting your foot down and saying not fundamentally mental. And the way I think about it is, what makes it not fundamentally mental? That's the worry. If you say it's because it's constituted by what's physical, it looks like you've using the conclusion of your argument to set the argument up. So I tend to do it partly with I think in the literature it's called an object-dependent notion of physical. Take the things that are mental, whether or not fundamentally, put them to one side. You're left with a whole lot of things that aren't in any sense mental, the stones and so on. I mean, they're not at all mental, not even non-fundamentally. And then say that the kind of stuff you have in stones and cars and trees and so on, that's causally closed, or that's determinationally closed. I mean, so made of things that are found outside sentient beings. That's the way I want to run the via negativa, and it doesn't appeal to a notion of fundamental. I can see that there's difficulties there, but I was using it because it's a rather simpler way of explaining the idea.
Sure, fair enough. That makes sense. So I think we wanted to take a question from the user Chisholm here. If you want to unmute, you can ask your question.
Hi, thanks for doing this AMA. I wanted to ask something that you guys talked about before, your view on causation, that it's essentially macroscopic, but it doesn't mean it's not reducible, or irreducible, I should say. I wanted to ask what your sort of, and I think in one of your papers you give this analogy to sort of thermodynamic processes. What kind of view do you have about the ontology of this sort of causal relation? Is it like a genuine feature of the world? And if so, does it make it seem a bit mysterious how you could have something that is macroscopic and yet it's not irreducible?
So let's get clear. You're not worrying about the ontology of causation in the sense, is it a relation between events, is it a relation between facts, and so on.
Right, not that. Just sort of what the status. So some people might say, for instance, to use the statistical mechanics example, that sort of these macroscopic properties, we can talk about them, but they're not real, right? They're fully reducible, and what really exists in the world is the microphysics. And I don't think you hold that sort of view about causation, right?
I don't hold. I mean, so my view about causation is like somebody who says, no, macrostates are real. It's a real fact about this thing that it has a certain temperature, and in a way that's an extra fact to its precise microstate. It's saying not only is it in its precise macrostate, but it's in a microstate that shares a certain property with lots of other microstates, which is an extra fact over and above being in that precise microstate. And I feel the same about causes, that it's a real enough thing. Now, being at a certain temperature, that's reducible, but it's generic. It's a real feature of the system, but as I said, it's something extra to the specificity of the actual microstate. I mean, it's something which is determined by the actual microstate, but it's to do with the microstate. I mean, as it were, it's extra. I mean, it's something you get by throwing away a lot of the information in the microstate. But do you think that temperatures aren't real?
Well, I'm not really sure on my given my own view, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is something like, sometimes people in the literature will give this sort of argument. They'll say something like, look, if we have some microstates or even an ensemble of microstates, let's suppose we just with the numbers we have, calculate some degenerate property. Let's call it temperature prime or something. And they'll say, so presumably we won't want to be committed to temperature prime. We just invented some sort of metric given some probabilistic view of microstates. So why should we be committed to real temperature, but also not be committed to this sort of degenerate property I just came up with given the microstates?
So temperatures fit into various laws of an interesting kind. They're real patterns, ideal gas laws, and so on. And it's not true that any arbitrary collection of microstates will similarly fit into laws. So I mean, I think that gives the macrostates that we recognize a certain objectivity, that they enter into real patterns. I mean, when I say real patterns, I'm actually thinking of Dennett's paper, real patterns. That's what constitutes those coarse-grained classifications as real and substantial. I mean, sometimes I worry, is there some kind of worrying anthrocentricity here? Look, I'm starting to get tired. We can't go on forever, but no, I'm fine for the moment. Mightn't there be some other ways of grouping microstates into macrostates that do enter into real patterns, and we're somehow blind to? I mean, are there other beings that recognize other kinds of microstates and have their own system of real patterns? Maybe so, but even if that were true, it wouldn't mean that our macrostates don't enter into real patterns. And I feel the same about causation. I mean, all the kinds of properties that enter into causal relations. They're macroscopic. You cotton onto them by throwing away some information about the precise microstate, but that doesn't make them non-real.
Sure, thank you.
Couldn't you say that the properties we sort of derive out of other ways of carving up the microstates or whatever, they're still genuine properties of those things? It's just that they're of less interest to us for some reason or another, and in part because they don't fit well into our physical theories. They don't enable us to make sort of predictions based on the patterns that we observe or so forth.
Sure. Sure. So maybe what that shows. So you say, look, well, why are the macrostates that we recognize, temperature, energy, and so on, why are they special? Why are they any better than any arbitrary, horrible, fibrillated collection of microstates? And the answer just is they fit into some real patterns, which other ones don't. I mean, that's a real objective difference. One doesn't add anything to that to say, right, the cobbled together macrostates aren't real. You can have that if you like. But the difference between the ones that fit into real patterns and the ones that don't is a genuine objective difference.
Right. So I wanted to move on. I guess we won't keep you for too long because I think we've been going for almost 2 hours now. So we'll wrap up soon enough. But I was wondering, you've talked with and engaged with the work of various panpsychists like Philip Goff, and at least as far as Goff is concerned, he thinks he can accept, as I understand it, your that sort of closure style argument, yet still maintain his sort of his brand of panpsychism. What do you think in general about panpsychism? Do you think there are other good arguments against it or reasons to doubt it? Or what approach would you take to that now?
So I think it's doubly mismotivated. So how could I put it? So it's kind of driven by an itch which actually doesn't amount to a good motivation. And it scratches that itch by appealing to a metaphysical picture which is independently no good. Right, so the itch is to try and find room for the possibility of zombies. And the resource they appeal to is a certain kind of Humean view of the nature of properties, which is a very unhappy view. So we know how the story goes. So the thought is, surely there could be beings who are physically just like us, but not conscious, nobody at home, zombies, philosophical zombies. And let's just start with the idea that such beings are possible. I think it's a mistake. I don't think they are possible. I think they're conceivable, but I think the argument from conceivability to possibility is no good. I think what's really going on is that people are just intuitive dualists, so of course they think that zombies are possible, just an expression of their mistaken dualism. But anyway, so there are many people, including Philip Goff, who think that zombies are possible. So that's the itch that doesn't really need scratching. And then the way they make zombies possible is they say, look, physics just gives us a whole structure of laws, and it doesn't tell us which properties enter into the laws. So it tells us what mass does and what accelerations do and what gravity does and what charge does, but it doesn't tell us what they really are. So the idea is that we've got two things here. We've got the structure of laws, this pattern of laws, and then in addition, there's the actual properties that play the nomological roles that fit into the structure of laws. And I never used to think about that view very much. Leave the zombies to one side for the moment. Just think about this view that the structure of laws is one thing and which properties fill them is another. That the same properties could enter into different laws, and the same laws could have different properties playing their roles in them. I never used to think about it very much. And then there was David Lewis and Ray Langton's work on Ramseyan humility, and I thought I'd better have a look at this. And the view was, look, here's the world we're in, and there's another possible world, which is just like our world. You know, it looks just the same, it behaves just the same, but it's got something different, a different quantity playing the mass role. And what we should be humble about is the fact we don't know whether we're in this world or that world. And I looked at that argument, took me about 6 seconds. I thought, no, that's horrible. That's horrible. That's not a different world. I mean, I looked at that argument and I thought, no, I'm a dispositional essentialist. Straight away, it took me 6 seconds or so. Once I understood the argument, I thought, no, I don't know that. I'm going to be a dispositional essentialist. That's just another world. I mean, that other world in which there's another quantity, they say, playing the mass role. That's just this world again. And the quantities have their nomological roles essentially, and vice versa. I mean, that seems to me entirely natural view, which rules out the panpsychist idea. Panpsychist idea is that we have a world just like this with all the same physical structure, but the properties that fill the pain role in some other world are different from the ones that fill it in this world. And in that other world, the pain role is filled by non-conscious properties. And that's how zombies are possible. And once we find out that, I mean, this is where the panpsychism comes in, once we find out that some of the things that fill the roles in this world are conscious, you may as well suppose that they're all conscious. But the whole thing seems to me a complete mess. The idea that the laws of physics don't fix the properties, and B, the idea that you want to make space for zombies. Those seem to me terrible ideas.
Right. Yeah. So the sort of Russellian monism, you think is false.
Yeah.
But Chong was a user in the chat was wondering that you don't have to endorse that view in order to be a panpsychist. Do you think there's some sort of alternative maybe that they could appeal to without?
I think you have to make your choice. So, Hedda Hasselmuck, you've had her on, haven't you?
Yes.
Hedda, she says, if you're Russellian monist, this kind of Humean view, the properties and the laws only contingently connected, then you'll have one line of argument for panpsychism, which I just gestured at. But she says, even if you're a dispositional essentialist, there's a different argument for panpsychism. And it's to do with the fact that the only model we have for causal relations is the built-in pushiness of states like pain. I mean, that's roughly her line of argument. So everything that's causally potent had better be mental. I mean, I don't find that a very powerful line of argument. I think she's in trouble because she thinks you can consistently run both that argument and the Russellian version. I think they're in a great deal of tension. Look, it's even worse. I really don't understand all the enthusiasm for panpsychism, but perhaps I'm just showing that I'm stuck in my ways. But apart from its being ill-motivated, it generates all kinds of horrible problems of its own. Yes. So we have the kind of consciousness that goes with the fundamental entities, whatever they are, and then when they combine into big things, we're going to get different kinds of consciousness. And I guess there's another line of argument for panpsychism, which is the idea that how can, this is Galen Strawson is very moved by this, how can consciousness be constituted by non-consciousness? That's basically his worry. And now if you've got that line of thought, or indeed any other motivation for panpsychism, there's still a worry about how can whole consciousness of human beings be constituted out of the funny different kind of consciousness you get with electrons and quarks and so on. So I'm very happy to leave it all to them. I have no inclination to go in the panpsychist direction.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. What's always felt sort of implausible about it to me, among other things, is that, look, it seems that conscious things are typically quite dynamic. They have sort of information processing features, and there's a lot of things that we find in the world that don't have those sorts of properties. And like, it just seems to me that a rock is sort of not the sort of candidate for a conscious thing, or an electron, or all these other things. And the view which commits us to saying that they are conscious is would have to be very strongly motivated to overcome that intuition, I think.
Quite. And even if you do say they're conscious, I mean, it doesn't seem to do any work, because you're still left with the puzzle about how the consciousness of dynamic things relates to the static consciousness of the rock-like elements. So, yes.
So we had a question from Jez in the chat, who mentions that he's long been a big fan of your book, Thinking About Consciousness, and he was wondering that it's been about 2 decades, I think, came out in 2002, since that was published, and he was wondering, how do you feel about it now? Are there things you wish you had put in or taken out, and so forth?
Interesting. No, I'm pretty happy with it. I mean, the chapter on phenomenal concepts, I've changed my mind about that quite a lot, as I described earlier. So I slightly feel I could have done that better, but got to have a first go. And the chapter on conceivability to possibility, I got into some tangles because I started with Kripke at the end of Naming Necessity, and then I said, right, this is the standard two-dimensionalist argument, and I now think that misreads Kripke. There's a interesting argument in Kripke. I've written a couple of papers about that. I mean, they're overlapping. One wasn't published, but they're both on my website. And I feel bad because I kind of say, look, here's how the two-dimensional argument works. It assumes that if you can refer to something directly, you'll know everything about it a priori, everything essential about it a priori. And I said, how could Kripke possibly have thought that? And I said, look, maybe the greatest minds make terrible mistakes. And since then, I've come to the view that wasn't Kripke's argument at all. And his argument's a very interesting and cogent one. And the terrible mistake is all due to Frank Jackson and David Chalmers. So I feel a bit bad about that. And I in retrospect, would prefer that I'd done that bit differently. But the general line that all the hoo-ha about consciousness and anti-physicals about consciousness is just driven by an unsupported intuition of dualism, I still feel that very strongly, and I kind of feel that that somehow I could have done more to be persuasive about that. I don't know. You can see that there's plenty of philosophers who have that intuition. Maybe they don't want to be told that it's just a brute intuition. They want to find something behind it. But I think you get much better explanations of everything if you regard that as an unargued intuition. If anybody's interested, I've recently written a paper for the Oxford Handbook on the philosophy of consciousness called "The Problem of Consciousness," where I push that line a bit harder, and I say what I think about panpsychism as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can't have been expected to predict all the different things that people would end up saying about consciousness, and obviously you can't say everything. It's not, the book has to be cut off somewhere. But yeah, I mean, I agree with what Jez was saying. It is a great book and important in the literature. So I guess just in closing, since I don't want to keep you too long, I was just wondering what your take is on, as a sort of a meta question, just the value of philosophy more generally. Why is it worth doing, and I guess for you individually, and just more generally as a society.
Interesting. I'm very lucky. I've been happy doing it all my life, and for me it's because I'm intellectually curious. I think curious, and I'd have a clear view about everything. I mean, of course, it's never going to happen to get everything sorted out, but I enjoy being puzzled and trying to figure out what's the right answer. And philosophy lets you do that across any range of topics that have the right kind of puzzlement involved. I mean, I think philosophy really is puzzle solving, but that makes it sound trivial. But in truth, I mean, it's a certain kind of puzzle. It's when our current thinking, everyday thinking, science, put it all in together, involves incoherence, contradiction. One line of argument leads you one place, and a different line of argument, equally plausible and compelling, leads you to the opposite view, and you've got to sort something out. And I'm just very happy that I've always enjoyed doing that. I mean, it's not necessarily a great thing for a philosopher, because it makes me jump around topics. I mean, I think in some ways more worthwhile philosophers are those who find their one topic and they stick to it and they become real experts backwards and forwards. And I tend to have a roving eye and move on often once I've figured something out to my satisfaction. But that's just why philosophy is nice for philosophers. Is it a good thing more generally? Yeah, I mean, I think not to say that everybody should be philosophical. Not everybody has that kind of restless kind of intellectual curiosity, dissatisfaction if everything's not in place. And there's no reason that people, I mean, this thing that unexamined life is not worth living, I don't believe that. It's not necessary for everybody to do this. But I think the world would be a much worse place if nobody did it. And it would be very sad if people didn't try and understand the fundamental puzzles of reality. It also has obviously spin-off effects. I mean, it's terrific training for young people, and I think people are increasingly realizing that the kind of mental attitude that leads people to philosophy and makes them do well at it as students is an attitude that's useful in all kinds of other places. But I wouldn't want to justify philosophy instrumentally in that way, that people should study philosophy because it makes them better at other things. I think, as I say, figuring out difficult central intellectual problems, getting an answer is seems to me among the good things in life, and I'm glad I've been able to do something like that.
That's excellent. Yeah, I think I share a lot of those sentiments. So we won't keep you any longer. Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been well over 2 hours now to take our questions and give some of your thoughtful responses.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I've enjoyed that a lot. I'm now tired and I'm going to have a beer.